Well everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the Google Pixel 8a and see how this particular phone holds up in 2025. Now, the Pixel 8a is not really that old, it's like less than a year old as of this point, so you could probably imagine that this phone is probably still worth buying. It's really not that old of a device. However, there might be some other devices that I would probably recommend more so how it compares against some other competition. So let's go ahead and take a look how this phone holds up. Number one, if you want to pick up this phone or some other phones I would recommend buying this particular year, links will be down in the description below. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Google Pixel 8a, when you take a look at this particular phone on the front side, this device is giving you a 6.1-inch OLED display. So this particular phone, it's giving you actually a pretty decent type of display. So it's a hole punch display, it's 120 Hz, and it does get 2000 nits of brightness, which that in and of itself is actually pretty impressive. Being able to go through and buy a phone like a Pixel 8a that's going to be giving you that type of brightness that's supposed to be kind of like a mid-tier budget phone is actually pretty impressive. It still is like a pretty good display, and I would say for an OLED display, it's an always on display too. Like this is still a really good looking type of device when it comes down to it. So I would definitely say from that side, it definitely gets a thumbs up for me for the most part. You're getting kind of like this like rounded corner side to it. It's not like super flat, but it's like kind of flat for the most part. You're still maintaining things like a USB Type-C port on the bottom side of these particular devices too, which that in and of itself is another really nice thing kind of going on for this type of device too when it comes down to it. So when you are taking a look at something like the Pixel 8a, just from the front side, it still looks great. On the back side, you are getting this plastic back on the back of this phone, which could be kind of interesting depending on how you're looking at it. I mean, I definitely do think that is somewhat of a funny thing, like still getting a plastic back, even if it is a frosted plastic back. Still getting a plastic back in any form is still kind of interesting to say the least. You're getting this dual camera setup on the backside as well, and that's kind of all you're really getting inside of this device. I still think this device does a really decent job at things you would kind of throw at it for the most part, but it definitely would make a lot more sense to go ahead and maybe like buy a different device that would be giving you a little bit more capability here and there. But I would still say for the most part, if you are going to go through and pick up a phone, this is still a pretty decent device for the most part. It doesn't really look that terrible, and at least on the backside, you're still getting things like wireless charging and a lot of other things like that too built in inside of this type of device. But there are a few things missing out on this phone that a lot of flagships have nowadays. Number one, we do actually get a little bit more brightness inside of our panels nowadays. So it's not like the biggest deal in the world, but depending on how you're looking at it, a lot of devices nowadays do end up kind of giving you a little bit like maybe like 3000 nits of brightness. That's what the Pixel 9s are giving you. But also phones like the Pixel 9, they're also basically going through and giving you essentially like these, super bright panels, like 3000 nits of brightness or something like that. And that in and of itself, it is kind of a big deal to kind of think about here. So if you are going to go through and like pick up a device, that in and of itself, it is kind of a big deal depending on how you're looking at it. So, that wouldn't be the main reason why I would upgrade, but that could be a reason why some people would recommend upgrading in some cases. When it comes down to the price tag though, it's really hard to beat the price of this particular phone. This phone costs about $214 right now. That really isn't that much of a price to pay for a device like this. Like that is a very affordable type of price to get for this type of phone. Like it's really not that expensive of a device. You're still getting a pretty good price for this type of device, and for less than $220, I mean, that is pretty impressive. I think when this phone first retailed, it was around like $600 or $599 or something like that. So the fact that this phone is this price now, less than a year later, it's pretty impressive. When it comes down to the camera layout though, the camera on this thing, it's pretty much kind of what you'd expect for the most part. It's not really anything super crazy. You're essentially getting a dual camera setup on the backside. So it is a 64 megapixel wide angle lens, then a 13 megapixel ultra wide camera. Then you're also still maintaining a 13 megapixel ultra wide camera on the front side. So that right there is still actually pretty decent. It's not really that terrible of a lens to have in and of itself. So I do think if you are going to go through and like pick up a phone, that actually is not a terrible type of layout to have inside of a device either. So that right there means that this type of phone from a camera perspective, it's not terrible. It's going to be able to definitely get the job done depending on what you're throwing at it. But do keep in mind that if you are planning on going through and you're using this phone on like an everyday basis, you might not get the best experience when compared to something like a Pixel 9 Pro. This thing doesn't have like 8K capability. It doesn't give you 4K at 60 on the front, and it's missing out on another lens that the Pixel 9 Pro has, like the telephoto lens, a dedicated telephoto lens. But I still think this type of camera, for the most part, it still gets the job done, and it really isn't that bad of a lens when it comes down to it. Now, when it comes down to some other areas of this phone, like the software longevity, you have to remember that the Pixel 8a, it just came out, and if it matches in line with something like what Google is doing with the Pixel 8, this phone still has a long future ahead of it. This thing is still giving you 7 major versions of Android ahead of it, which is actually pretty impressive. So I do think that in and of itself is a very, very nice thing to kind of think about. You're going to be able to go through and pick up this type of device and get a pretty long-lasting phone. Like, this device is going to be lasting for quite a bit of time when it comes down to that software perspective. So I think from that side too, that is a very, very big important thing to kind of think about here. Like, if you're planning on going through and to get this type of device, you're going to be able to still get a device and still be able to maintain a phone that's going to be getting so many years of software upgrades. So I think that is a very important thing to keep in mind that way. Even with the battery life, this thing is giving you a 4,492 mAh battery. That's a very big size battery to have inside of a device too. And that really makes me feel very comfortable of like recommending this phone to people, because it is going to be one of those types of devices that still probably last for quite a bit of time. And you're still going to be able to go through and get, these types of phones and still get software support for so many years and still get a battery life inside of your device that does last for quite a bit of time. I will say though, from the battery life perspective, the only area where this phone doesn't really hold up the best in from battery is probably when it comes down to reverse wireless charging, because this phone doesn't really have it. So that is kind of a disadvantage there, but it's not really even the biggest tool of all time either. So when it comes to those sides, that kind of covers it up there. And finally, when it comes down to the performance side, you have to remember that within this type of phone, you're still getting that Google Tensor G3 chipset inside with 8GB of RAM. So this phone, for the most part, is still going to be able to go through and still going to be able to give you really decent performance for its price. It still has the same amount of RAM as a majority of phones nowadays, and the Tensor G3 chipset, it's still pretty good. There's not really too many complaints I've had with it. So especially when it comes down to the performance side of this type of device, you're still going to feel like you're getting a pretty good performing device when it comes down to it. So I think that in and of itself is a very important thing to keep in mind there. Like, these types of devices still perform very well. When you're comparing this phone against maybe the Snapdragon 8 Elite that just came out, I don't know if this phone's necessarily going to be able to do the best when it comes down to that side, but you're still going to be able to get a really good performing device, a very, very fast phone. But again, maybe compared to the Snapdragon chipsets, those ones are probably going to be a little bit better here, but still, I think this one does a really good job of basically a majority of things that you throw out here as well. So overall, what I'll definitely tell you is, I think the Google Pixel 8a is one of those phones that I still think is completely worth buying, obviously, but when compared to some of the competition, it might make more sense to switch over to some of those phones, right? Like, I think buying a used Pixel 9 or Pixel 9 Pro is obviously better, but even a used Google Pixel like 8 Pro, if you want a bigger sized phone, if you can swing for one of those ones, I would recommend buying one of those, or buy a used Galaxy S24. Those ones aren't that much more expensive than this one, and I think that one probably would make overall more sense probably for a lot of people to buy rather than this type of device. So when it comes down to that, that's kind of how I see this phone holding up from that side. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.